It's no secret that the United States farmers and ranchers produce more ag products now than what they did in, say, the 1930s or the 1940s. But does that mean we've become more productive? Well, you see, productivity is a measure of the amount of output we get per unit of input. So in order to figure out if we have become more productive in the United States, let's dive into both the trends of inputs and outputs of farms. So before we do that, we're going to classify farm inputs into four main categories, four big broad categories. These categories are capital, labor, materials, and land. And you see, capital is those things such as durable equipment and structures. That might be your tractors and your barns. Labor is both hired and self-employed labor. That is a farm input. Another main input that we're starting to see, or we see a lot of, is materials, manufactured goods. Things such as energy, using gasoline or diesel on the farm, or electricity. The use of agricultural chemicals. And then other things such as purchase services, maybe like agricultural consulting or in insurance. Those are all inputs. And then another one that we're all familiar with, especially in agriculture, is land. And that's that real estate used in production. So have we been using more farm inputs? The amount that we use to produce the amount of outputs, or these inputs that we put into the farm, are they increasing? Well, as a whole, on the aggregate, across all four of these main categories, no, not really. We're using roughly the same amount of inputs that we have for a long time. That number has remained fairly stable. So why can we say that? Well, because stuff like labor, we actually use less labor now because of more efficient technology. The amount of land that we use, it stays the same. And usually the amount of equipment that we use and structures, it stays the same. So on the aggregate, on the whole, whenever you combine all these four main categories, yeah, the amount of input that we use has been relatively stable. So the land use is stable. We can't use any more land because, frankly, we are using all of the productive land in the United States already. But here is something that is increasing, and it's the use of manufactured resources. Use of fertilizer, use of chemicals, use of GMO or modified seeds, use of different inputs such as tractors, bigger and better tractors type deal. Those manufactured resources, the amount that we use has increased. And this is increased because of new technologies. As a new chemical comes out that is bigger and better than the last one, we wind up using more of it. Or as fertilizer effectivity increases, then we are going to use more of those manufactured goods to help increase our productivity, to help increase the amount of output that we get out. And on the aggregate, the inputs have remained stable, mainly because the land use has remained stable, labor has fallen, but whenever we get into these manufactured resources, we see that they have increased, and we're using more manufactured resources nowadays. Another thing that we must note, and I'm sure that everybody that's in the agricultural business already knows this, farming and ranching is a highly capital-intensive business. For you to get into something as simple as farming, for example, you typically need the land, which is very highly capital-intensive. You need the tractors, you need the equipment, you need barns, you need storage bins sometimes. You need all of the equipment to do that as well as the labor. So it is a highly capital-intensive business, meaning you have to have a lot of these durable equipment and structures just to farm or just to ranch, not to mention the amount of land that you typically need. So now that we know that farm input is remaining relatively stable, what's going on with output? And what we notice is that U.S. ag output has increased at an average rate of 4.2% from 1948 to 2013. From 1948 to 2013, farm output has increased by 4.3% every year. So overall, our output is increasing. Whenever we divide it up and look at crop output during the same time, it's increased at a rate of 4.3%, whereas livestock output has increased at a rate of 3.4%. So we know that the amount of inputs are remaining relatively stable, but yet output is increasing at a rate of 4.2%. Well, this leads into our productivity. You see, as I mentioned in the beginning, productivity is the level of output per unit of input. So it's a ratio. And it basically says, how much do you get out to how much you put in? Are you getting more crops out using less fertilizer? Are you getting more crops out using less land? Or how much do you get out with how much you put in? So the amount that we put in is the inputs. We said that it remains fairly stable. But the amount that we get out is our output. And it has been increasing at a rate of 4.2%. So our productivity has been increasing. And it's actually increased dramatically since World War II. Crop production in 1990 was double of what it was in the 1950s. And when it comes to the inputs, the amount of land that we've been using really hasn't gone up all that much since World War II. But what's going on is we are combining that land and the productivity of that land with these manufactured and other non-land inputs to increase our productivity. We're using better and more efficient fertilizer. We are using irrigation more efficiently. And we're using all of these manufactured, such as chemical, all these manufactured inputs to increase our productivity. So crop production has doubled since the 1990s, or since 1950, and then it was double of what it was in 1950 in 1990. And that's because we're using land and these non-land inputs to increase our productivity. So if we look at the formula, which the formula for productivity is basically the amount of output divided by the amount of input, or it's a ratio of how much do we get out in terms of output versus how much we put in an input. And if we remember back to what we talked about, and if output is increasing at 4.2%, but input is really not increasing all that much, it means we're getting more out with the same amount of inputs. So what we've noticed is that from 1948 to 2013, the level of productivity has increased at an annual rate of 4%. So that means that our inputs are staying the same, but our outputs are increasing at a rate of about 4% every year, meaning our productivity is increasing at an average rate of 4%.